Abigail woke to the sound of glass shattering downstairs, the same sound that had accompanied her for years, always followed by her father's drunken shouts and her stepmother's resigned sighs. At 18, she had learned to recognize every nuance of that symphony of despair that echoed through the worn walls of their small house in San Benito. Hey there, thanks for being here. Leave a like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what you think of the story. Let's keep going. Abigail, get down here now. The harsh voice cut through the morning silence like a blade. She remained motionless for a moment, her eyes fixed on the damp-stained ceiling where a spider was patiently weaving its web. There was something different in her father's tone today, an urgency she couldn't decipher. Barefoot, she descended the creaking steps. Her father stood in the kitchen, hair disheveled, still wearing yesterday's dirty clothes. Her stepmother remained, hunched over the sink, pretending not to listen. Put on your best clothes, he said, avoiding her gaze. We're going to town today. Abigail frowned. He never took her to town. In fact, he barely left the house except to work the neighboring fields when he could find employment. Why? For an instant, something flickered across his face, almost like remorse, but it hardened again quickly. Just do as I say. The sun rose timidly between gray clouds, unaware that this would be Abigail's last dawn in that house. The wagon wheels creaked against the dusty road as San Benito's buildings emerged. From the morning haze, Abigail sat in uncomfortable silence beside her father, who gripped the reins with white knuckles. He hadn't spoken a word since they left the house, but she could smell the whiskey on his breath despite the early hour. Her stepmother had watched them leave from the doorway, arms crossed, her face unreadable. No goodbye, no explanation, just that same cold indifference that had defined Abigail's entire childhood. Pa, she ventured quietly. What are we doing in town? He flinched as if her voice had struck him. You'll see soon enough. The streets of San Benito buzzed with unusual activity for a Tuesday morning. Groups of men clustered around storefronts, their voices carrying an excitement that made Abigail's stomach twist with unease. Women hurried past with their heads down, pulling their children closer as they approached the town square. The crowd thickened. Abigail could see a makeshift platform erected in the center, surrounded by eager faces. Her father's breathing became labored, his hands trembling as he guided the wagon to a stop near the back of the gathering. Listen to me, he said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Whatever happens today, I need you to know that I never wanted this. Fear crept up Abigail's spine like ice water. Pa, what are you talking about? He turned to look at her then, and she saw something she had never seen before in his bloodshot eyes. Tears threatening to spill over. But beneath the tears lay something else, a desperate determination that terrified her more than his usual anger. The bank, he said hoarsely. They're taking the house next week. We owe more than we could pay in 10 lifetimes. Abigail's heart began to race. We'll find another way. We always do. He shook his head slowly. Not this time. There's a man. He said he'd pay enough to clear the debt. Said he'd take good care of you. The words hit her like a physical blow. Take care of me and around them. The crowd was growing. Restless, someone was shouting instructions from the platform, though she couldn't make out the words over the roaring in her ears. They're selling me. The words escaped her lips as barely a whisper. Her father's face crumpled, but he nodded. It's the only way, Abigail. The only way to save what's left. She stared at him. This broken man who had raised her without love, who had seen her as nothing more than another mouth to feed, another burden to bear. And now, in his final act as her father, he was trading her away like livestock. I'm not going, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. But even as she spoke, she knew she had no choice. Where could she run? Who would take her in? She was 18 years old with no money, no skills, and no one in the world who cared whether she lived or died. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square. Ladies and gentlemen, Let the bidding begin. The platform felt like a stage for her own execution. Abigail stood there, her father's rough hand gripping her arm, as dozens of faces stared up at her with calculating eyes. The auctioneer, a portly man with gold teeth, gestured toward her, as if she were a prize cow, 18 years old, healthy, can cook and clean. He announced with theatrical flair, perfect for household work or other arrangements. Laughter rippled through the crowd at his suggestive tone. Abigail's cheeks burned with shame, but she forced herself to stand straight. If this was to be her fate, she would not cower. The bidding started at $20. A farmer near the front raised his hand, his wife whispering urgently in his ear. Then 30 from a merchant she recognized from the general store. The numbers climbed steadily, $40, $50, $60 each. It felt like another chain around her soul. Her father stood beside the platform, his hat in his hands, unable to meet her eyes. The crowd jeered and called out suggestions, treating her humiliation like entertainment. Some women in the crowd looked away in disgust, but none spoke up. $75, called a man with a cruel smile. She'll make a fine addition to my household. Abigail shuddered at the way his eyes roamed over her. She closed her own eyes, trying to disappear into herself, when a voice cut through the noise like thunder. $100. The crowd fell silent. Heads turned to locate the speaker, and Abigail opened her eyes to see a tall black man standing at the edge of the gathering. His clothes were simple but clean, his posture straight despite the hostile stares now fixed upon him, scars marked. His dark skin old wounds that spoke of a hard life, but his eyes held a dignity that made others look away. "Did you hear me?" he repeated, his voice steady and clear. $100. The auctioneer's gold teeth disappeared behind pursed lips. "Now see here. Is this not an auction?" The man interrupted. "I have the money." Murmurs of outrage swept through the crowd. Someone spat on the ground near his feet. A woman clutched her pearls and whispered, "The audacity." But the man Thomas, she heard someone mutter his name with venom, remained unmoved by their hatred. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his coat and held it up for all to see. $100. He repeated, "Cash." The auctioneer looked nervously between Thomas and the angry crowd. "Perhaps we should consider other bidders." $110, shouted the cruel-eyed man, his face red with indignation. $120, Thomas replied without hesitation. Back and forth it went, the tension thick as molasses. But Thomas had something his competitor didn't: every dollar he had saved, every coin he had earned through backbreaking labor since gaining his freedom. He bid methodically, calmly, while his opponent grew increasingly flustered. At $150, the other man threw up his hands in disgust. "I won't be outbid by his kind." Thomas stepped forward, still holding his pouch. $150, he said to the auctioneer. "Final offer." The silence stretched taut. Abigail found herself staring at this stranger who had just spent a fortune on her freedom, or perhaps her bondage. She couldn't tell which. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw something unexpected there. Not possession, but compassion. The auctioneer banged his gavel reluctantly. "Sold to the gentleman for $150. The crowd erupted in angry shouts. But Thomas was already moving toward the platform, his money counted out. As he handed over the bills, he spoke quietly to Abigail. "Come," he said, simply. "Let's go home." The wagon ride away from the town square felt like floating through a nightmare. Abigail sat rigid beside Thomas, her hands clenched in her lap, waiting for him to reveal his true intentions. Behind them, angry voices still echoed from the crowd, but Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the dusty road ahead. His wagon was simple but well-maintained, pulled by a gentle brown mare that responded to his quiet clicks and murmurs. Everything about him seemed deliberate, careful, so different from the chaos she had known all her life. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice barely audible above the creaking wheels. "To my home." he replied without looking at her. It's not much, but it's peaceful. She studied his profile, the strong jaw, the graying temples, the network of scars that disappear beneath his collar. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it for the first time. He glanced at her. Why what? Why did you? She struggled for words. Why did you spend so much money on me? What do you want? Thomas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. I want you to be safe. Safe. She repeated the word as if it were foreign. What does that mean? It means no one will hurt you. No one will touch you without your permission. No one will sell you again. The simplicity of his words made her throat tighten. And what do I have to do in return? Nothing you don't want to do. She turned to stare at him fully. I don't understand. You will, he said gently. In time. They rode in silence after that, leaving the outskirts of San Benito behind. The landscape gradually changed from dusty streets to rolling fields, then to a small path that wound through a grove of oak trees. As they emerged from the shade, Abigail saw a modest cabin, nestled against a hillside, with a small garden and a chicken coop nearby. This is home, Thomas said, bringing the wagon to a stop. The cabin was tiny compared to even her father's run-down house, but it was immaculate. The wooden walls had been recently whitewashed, and wildflowers grew in neat rows along the front porch. It looked like something from a dream, the kind of peaceful place she had never dared imagine. Thomas climbed down and offered her his hand. She hesitated, then accepted his help stepping from the wagon. His touch was gentle, his palm calloused from honest work. Are you hungry? He asked, unhitching the mare. She realized she hadn't eaten since yesterday. Her father had been too nervous that morning to think of food. Yes, there's bread and preserves inside. Help yourself to whatever you need. He began tending to the horse, and Abigail stood there, uncertain. Was this some kind of test? Was he waiting for her to steal something so he could punish her? Go on, he said without looking up. You're not a prisoner here. The cabin's interior was sparse but clean. A simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and a bed in the corner covered with a patchwork quilt. Shelves lined one wall, holding a few books, some dishes, and glass jars filled with dried herbs and preserves. On the table sat a loaf of fresh bread and a jar of strawberry preserves. Her mouth watered, but she waited, listening for his footsteps. When he entered a few minutes later, she was still standing by the door. You didn't eat, he observed. I was waiting for permission. Something flickered across his face, pain, maybe, or recognition. Abigail, he said quietly, you don't need my permission to eat when you're hungry. You don't need my permission to rest when you're tired. This is your home now too. She blinked back, sudden tears. I don't know how to do that. Do what? Live without permission? Thomas nodded slowly, as if he understood something she couldn't yet put into words. Then we'll learn together. The first week passed like a cautious dance between 2 wounded souls. Abigail woke each morning expecting Thomas to reveal his true nature, to demand payment for his kindness, to claim his ownership over her. But each day, he simply went about his quiet routines, tending his garden, caring for the animals, reading by the fireplace in the evenings. He had given her the bed and made himself a simple pallet by the hearth. When she protested, he merely said, a lady deserves comfort, as if the matter were settled. She had never been called a lady before. On the 4th morning, she found him outside splitting wood for the stove. His shirt was damp with sweat, the scars on his back visible through the thin fabric. Some were thin lines, others thick and raised a map of suffering she recognized in her own soul. Let me help, she said. He paused, the axe balanced in his hands. You don't have to work, Abigail. But I want to. The word surprised her. When had she ever wanted to work? But this felt different, not obligation, but choice. He studied her face, then nodded. The chickens need feeding, and the garden could use weeding. As the days passed, They developed an easy rhythm. She tended the chickens and helped with meals while he worked on repairs and maintenance. They spoke little, but the silence between them was comfortable, not tense like the silences she had known before. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Thomas pulled out a worn book. "Do you read?" he asked. Abigail shook her head. Embarrassed, never learned properly. "Would you like to?" The question hung in the air. Learning to read had always seemed as impossible as flying something for other people, not for her. "Yes," she whispered. Thomas opened the book, a collection of poetry, and began to read aloud. His voice was deep and melodious, giving life to words about meadows and streams, love and hope. Abigail closed her eyes and let the sounds wash over her, painting pictures in her mind of a world beyond survival. "This one's my favorite," he said, and read, "Still I Rise" by a woman named Maya Angelou. The words spoke of resilience, of refusing to be broken by others' hatred and cruelty. When he finished, Abigail opened her eyes to find him watching her. "She was like you," he said quietly, "strong, even when she didn't know it yet." "I'm not strong," Abigail protested. "I let them sell me. I didn't fight. You survived," Thomas replied. "That took more strength than fighting would have." The next morning, she woke to find a small slate and piece of chalk beside her bed. Thomas was already outside, pretending not to notice her tears. By the end of the second week, she could write her own name without help. The letters felt far under her fingers, but they were hers, the first thing that had ever truly belonged to her. "Thomas," she said one evening as they worked in the garden together, "why were you at the auction? You don't seem like the kind of man who—" She trailed off, not knowing how to finish. He was quiet for a long moment, his hands still among the tomato plants. "I made a promise once," he said finally, "to someone I loved very much. I promised that if I ever had the chance to save someone the way she saved me, I would. What happened to her? She died before I could repay her kindness." His voice was steady, but she heard the pain beneath it. "When I saw you on that platform, looking so lost and afraid, I saw her looking back at me." Abigail's chest tightened. "So I'm just a way for you to keep your promise to a dead woman?" Thomas turned to face her fully. "You started that way," he admitted, "but now you're Abigail. You're yourself, and you're worth saving, not because of any promise, but because you matter." That night, for the first time since arriving, she slept without fear. 3 weeks into her new life, Abigail accompanied Thomas to town for supplies. She had dreaded this moment, knowing the stares and whispers that would follow them. But Thomas had asked if she wanted to come, and something in his patient tone made her realize he would wait for her to be ready. "Stay close," he said, as they entered the general store, not out of possessiveness but protection. The conversations died the moment they walked in. Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife, clutched her shawl tighter and moved to the far end of the counter. Two farmers by the window stopped their discussion to openly gawk. A young woman about Abigail's age pulled her children behind her skirts. Thomas moved through the store with quiet dignity, selecting flour, salt, and coffee beans. His movements were unhurried despite the hostile atmosphere. Abigail marveled at his composure. She could feel her hands trembling as she picked up a spool of thread. "Shameful," Mrs. Henderson muttered, loud enough to be heard. "A decent Christian woman would never." "Mum," Thomas interrupted politely, approaching the counter with his goods. "I believe these come to $2.30. Mrs. Henderson's lips pursed as she tallied the items with exaggerated care. $2.50. Abigail knew the woman was overcharging them, but Thomas simply counted out the money without protest. As he placed the coins on the counter, Mrs. Henderson snatched them up without touching his fingers. "Keep your receipts," she said coldly, "in case anyone asks where you got these goods." Outside the store, Abigail's anger finally erupted. "She cheated you and implied you were a thief." Thomas helped her into the wagon. "I know. Why didn't you say something? What would be the point?" He settled beside her, gathering the reins. Mrs. Henderson's opinion of me won't change, no matter what I say. But my behavior might change someone else's mind. Whose? Thomas nodded toward a small group of children watching them from across the street. They're still learning what to think about people like us. As they rode home, Abigail noticed how Thomas waved to everyone they passed, regardless of whether they acknowledged him. Some turned away in disgust. Others stared with curious faces, but very few nodded back. "Don't you ever get angry?" she asked. "Every day," he admitted. But anger burns the person carrying it more than the person is aimed at. That evening, as Thomas read to her from his poetry book, Abigail found herself studying his face in the firelight. The scars told stories of pain survived, but his eyes held something she was only beginning to understand: peace that came from living according to one's own values rather than others' expectations. "Thomas," she said when he finished reading, "what will people say about us living together like this?" He closed the book carefully. "They'll say whatever serves their need to feel superior. The question is, what do you think about us living together like this?" Abigail considered this. For the first time in her life, she felt safe, fed, valued. "I think," she said slowly, "that I'm learning what it means to be human. Then that's all that matters." But even as she nodded, Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful existence was fragile. The looks in town, the whispered conversations that stopped when they approached, there was a storm building around them. She just hoped they would be strong enough to weather it together when it finally broke. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under their door while they worked in the garden. Abigail found it when she went inside for water. Her name scrawled across the front in angry handwriting. "Thomas," she called, her voice tight with worry. He read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. When he finished, he folded it carefully and placed it on the table. "What does it say?" Abigail asked, though the dread in her stomach already knew. "The town council wants to meet with us about our living arrangement." The letter was signed by Mayor Coleman, a man whose political ambitions were well known throughout San Benito. Behind his signature were, to others, Reverend Hayes from the Methodist Church and Samuel Woodmore, the influential businessman who owned half the stores in town. What do they want? Thomas moved to the window, gazing out at their peaceful garden. "To remind us of our place." Over the next few days, the pressure mounted. When Thomas went to buy seeds, the merchant claimed to be sold out. Mrs. Patterson, who had sometimes bought Abigail's mending work, sent word that her services were no longer needed. Children threw stones at their chickens when they thought no one was watching. But the worst came on Sunday morning as they walked past the Methodist church. Reverend Hayes emerged from the front steps. His congregation gathered behind him like a dark cloud. "Thomas," the Reverend called out, his voice carrying across the churchyard. A word. Thomas stopped, placing a protective hand on Abigail's arm. "Reverend, this situation you've created," Hayes continued, loud enough for everyone to hear, "it's causing quite a disturbance in our community." "What situation would that be?" "Don't play innocent. A man of your background living in sin with a white woman, it's an abomination." Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We're not living in sin. Thomas is never." "Hush, child," Hayes interrupted. "Your soul has clearly been corrupted, but it's not too late for redemption." Thomas stepped forward slightly. "Reverend, I respect your calling, but our private affairs, nothing is private when it threatens the moral fabric of our town." Hayes' voice rose with theatrical fervor. "The good people of San Benito will not stand for this mockery of Christian values." "And what would you have us do?" Thomas asked quietly. "You will end this arrangement immediately. The girl can work as a servant in a proper Christian household. As for you," he shrugged dismissively, "perhaps it's time you moved on to somewhere more suitable for your kind." The congregation murmured their agreement. Abigail saw faces she recognized from the general store, from the streets. all nodding along with the Reverend's words. Mrs. Henderson stood near the front, her expression smug with righteousness. "No," Abigail said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. The crowd fell silent. Reverend Hayes raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." I said no. Abigail stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice growing stronger. "Thomas saved my life. He's treated me with more kindness and respect than anyone in this town ever has. I won't leave him, and I won't let you drive him away." Hayes's face darkened. "Young woman, you clearly don't understand the gravity." "I understand perfectly," Abigail interrupted. "You're afraid that if people see us living peacefully together, they might start questioning the hate you preach." A shocked gasp rippled through the crowd. Thomas placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Come," he said softly. "We've said enough of this." They walked away. Reverend Hayes called after them. "This won't end here. Mark my words, this town won't tolerate your defiance much longer." That night, Abigail couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching shadows dance in the moonlight, while Thomas dozed fitfully by the fire. "I'm sorry," she whispered into the darkness. "I made things worse." "No," came his quiet reply. "You found your voice. That's never wrong." But even as his words comforted her, Abigail knew the Reverend had been right about one thing. This wouldn't end here. The storm they had sensed building was about to break, and she wondered if their newfound strength would be enough to survive it. The false accusation came 3 days. After their confrontation with Reverend Hayes, Thomas had gone to town alone to buy lamp oil, insisting that Abigail stay home after receiving strange looks from men loitering near their property. He returned that evening with grim news and empty hands. "They wouldn't sell to me," he said, hanging his hat by the door. Every store in town claimed to be out of oil. Abigail looked up from her mending. "All of them. Every last one." Thomas sat heavily in his chair. "And there's something else. Young Billy Morrison came running up to me. Said his mother's silver locket went missing from their laundry line. Said she's sure someone took it." "What does it have to do with you?" Thomas met her eyes. "Billy said his mother saw a tall black man walking past their house yesterday, around the time it disappeared." Abigail's blood ran cold. "But you weren't even in town yesterday." "I know, you know. But who's going to believe us?" They didn't have to wait long for an answer. The next morning, Sheriff Morrison, Billy's father, arrived with 2 deputies. Abigail watched from the window as they approached, their faces set with grim purpose. "Thomas Jefferson, Washington," the sheriff called out as Thomas emerged from the chicken coop. "You're under arrest for theft." "Sheriff Morrison," Thomas said calmly, setting down his bucket of eggs. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding. My wife's silver locket is missing, and you were seen in the area." Morrison's hand rested on his gun belt. "We're going to search your property." "You're welcome to look," Thomas replied. "But you won't find anything because I didn't take it." The deputies tore through their small cabin like hunting dogs. They upended mattresses, scattered Thomas's carefully organized books, and dumped out every jar and container they could find. Abigail stood on the porch, fury and helplessness warring in her chest as they destroyed the peaceful home Thomas had built. "Nothing here, Sheriff," one deputy reported. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Check the barn. Check everywhere." But they found nothing because there was nothing to find. Yet as Thomas had predicted, his innocence didn't matter. The sheriff had come with orders to arrest him, and he wouldn't leave empty-handed. "Thomas Washington," Morrison announced, producing iron shackles. "You're coming with us for questioning." "On what evidence?" Abigail demanded, stepping forward. "Evidence of being in the wrong place at the wrong time," Morrison replied coldly, "and having a reputation for inappropriate behavior with white women." Thomas caught Abigail's eye and shook his head slightly, warning her not to interfere further. As they shackled his hands, he spoke quietly. "Remember what I taught you about the garden," he said. "Water the tomatoes twice daily. The chickens need feeding at dawn and dusk." Abigail understood. He was telling her to keep living, to maintain their home while he was gone. But tears blurred her vision as they led him away. "This is wrong," she called after them. "He's innocent. Innocent men don't live in sin," Sheriff Morrison called back. "Maybe some time in jail will remind him of his proper place as the dust." Settled behind their wagon, Abigail sank onto the porch steps. For the first time since Thomas had bought her freedom, she was truly alone. But she wasn't the same frightened girl who had stood on that auction block. Thomas had shown her what dignity looked like, what strength could be. She would not let them destroy what they had built together. That evening, as she fed the chickens and watered the garden exactly as Thomas had instructed, Abigail began planning his rescue. She had learned to read, to write, to stand up for herself. Now she would learn to fight. For 2 days, Abigail maintained the facade of a broken woman. She tended Thomas's garden with trembling hands, fed the chickens while wiping away tears, and sat on the porch each evening staring at the empty road. Let the town watchers report back that she was properly defeated. But inside the cabin, by lamplight, she was planning. Thomas had taught her to read, and now she put that skill to use. She studied his books about local geography, traced the paths he had drawn showing routes through the mountains. She counted their savings modest but enough. Most importantly, she listened. Every day, someone came by. Mrs. Patterson arrived with false sympathy and genuine curiosity about whether Abigail would be seeking proper employment now. The minister's wife brought a basket of food and pointed questions about Abigail's spiritual condition. Even young Billy Morrison rode past their gate several times, his mother's stolen locket conspicuously displayed around his neck. Through these visits, Abigail pieced together the truth. Thomas was being held in the town jail, awaiting transfer to the county seat for trial. The trial would be a formality in a county where Thomas had no friends, and Abigail's testimony wouldn't be trusted. His conviction was assured. But the transfer wouldn't happen for another week. Sheriff Morrison was in no hurry. Let the uppity black man sit in a cell and contemplate his crimes. That evening, as Abigail fed the chickens one last time, she made her decision. If the town wanted to see her as a helpless woman, she would use the perception against them. She waited until midnight, then slipped out of the cabin dressed in her darkest clothes. The jail sat at the edge of town, a squat stone building with 2 cells and a front office where the sheriff slept. Abigail had walked past it countless times without paying attention. Now she studied every detail. One window on the side, barred, but not boarded. A single lamp burning in the front office. The sheriff's horse tied behind the building, ready for quick departures. No other guards. Morrison was confident that no one in San Benito would dare help a black prisoner escape. Abigail crept closer, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would wake the whole town. At the barred window, she whispered into the darkness, "Thomas." Silence, then movement, and his familiar voice. Shocked, "Abigail, what are you doing here?" "Getting you out." She pressed her face against the bars, relief flooding through her at the sight of him alive and unharmed. "No." His voice was firm. "It's too dangerous. They'll hunt us both. Let them try." Abigail surprised herself with her determination. "You saved me from that auction block. Now I'm saving you from this one." She pressed a small bundle through the bars: bread, dried meat, and a knife she'd taken from the kitchen. "Tomorrow night," she whispered. "Be ready, Abigail. Listen to me. No, you listen." Her voice carried a strength she'd never heard from herself before. "You taught me that I matter, that I'm worth saving. Well, so are you." As she slipped back into the shadows, Abigail thought about the young woman who had stood terrified on the auction platform just months ago. That girl had waited for others to decide her fate. But this woman would fight for the people she loved. The next evening, Abigail sat on her porch as usual, playing the part of the grieving woman one last time. But hidden beneath her skirts was Thomas's pistol, loaded and ready. In her saddlebags were supplies for a long journey, and in her heart was a resolve stronger than any fear the town of San Benito could inspire. Tomorrow, She would show them what a truly free woman could do. The rescue began with fire. At precisely midnight, Abigail set flame to the old hay barn. Behind Henderson's general store, she had doused it with lamp oil earlier, ensuring it would burn bright and fast. As the flames leaped skyward, church bells began ringing the alarm throughout San Benito. From her hiding spot behind the jail, Abigail watched Sheriff Morrison stumble from the building, still pulling on his boots. Within minutes, half the town was rushing toward the fire, including Morrison. The volunteer fire brigade formed bucket chains while men shouted orders, and women gathered their children to safety. In all the chaos, no one noticed a slight figure slipping around to the jail's side window. "Thomas," she whispered. Urgently. His face appeared at the bars immediately. "The fire that was you? Henderson overcharged you for flour last month," Abigail said, producing a small crowbar from her coat. "Consider it payment with interest." Despite everything, Thomas almost smiled. "You've been planning this, learning from the best." She wedged the crowbar against the window bars. They were old iron, set in crumbling mortar. After several minutes of careful work, she had loosened one bar enough to bend it aside. "Can you fit through?" Thomas tested the opening. It would be tight, but possible. As he worked his way through the narrow gap, Abigail kept watch on the street. The fire was consuming Henderson's barn entirely now, orange light dancing across the buildings. Most of the town remained focused on the spectacle. "Abigail," Thomas said as he dropped to the ground beside her, "this changes everything. They'll know you helped me. You can't go back to the cabin." "I know." She handed him the pistol and a bag of supplies. "That's why we're leaving together." "Where will we go?" "The mountains. You showed me the maps. Remember? There are old mining camps up there, abandoned places where we can hide until things calm down." They moved carefully through the shadows, avoiding the main streets where people were still rushing toward the fire. Abigail had hidden their horses in a grove outside town, along with everything they would need for the journey: food, blankets, Thomas's precious books, and the small amount of money they had saved. As they mounted their horses, the sound of shouting reached them from the direction of the jail. Someone had discovered Thomas's absence. "They'll be after us soon," Thomas said. "Let them come." Abigail's voice was steady as she turned her horse toward the dark mountains. "They're looking for a helpless girl and a broken man. They won't recognize who we become." They rode hard through the night, following deer paths and creek beds that would hide their tracks. Behind them, torches flickered in the distance as search parties formed, but Abigail felt no fear. For the first time in her life, she was truly free, not because someone had bought her freedom, but because she had claimed it herself. As dawn broke over the mountains, they paused to rest their horses by a crystal stream. Thomas looked at her with something like wonder. "Who are you?" he asked softly. Abigail considered the question. She thought of the terrified girl on the auction block, the grateful woman learning to read by firelight, and now this person who had just engineered a daring rescue. "I'm someone who learned that freedom isn't something you're given," she said finally. "It's something you take." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we're both free now." Below them, San Benito lay shrouded in morning mist. Looking small and harmless from this distance, Abigail felt no desire to look back. Their real life was just beginning. The abandoned mining camp nestled in a hidden valley, surrounded by pine trees and protected by steep rock walls. Thomas had found it years earlier during his explorations of the mountains, and now it became their sanctuary. The old cabins needed work, but they had good bones and kept out the wind and rain. For 3 weeks, they lived like pioneers, rebuilding their world from nothing. Abigail learned to set snares for rabbits and identify edible plants, while Thomas repaired the cabin roof and built them a small garden plot. In the evenings, they sat by their fire, and Thomas continued her reading lessons using the books they had managed to save. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Abigail finally asked the question that had been growing in her mind since the rescue. Tell me about her, she said, closing the poetry book they had been reading. The woman you made the promise to. Thomas stared into the fire for a long moment when he spoke. His voice carried the weight of old grief. Her name was Sarah Mae Johnson. He smiled slightly at the memory. Prettiest woman in 3 counties, or so everyone said. But that's not why I love her. Why did you love her? Because she saw me as a man, not as property, even when we were both enslaved on the Whitmore plantation, yes. The same Whitmore family that tried to have me arrested. Sarah treated me with dignity. She'd slip me extra food when I was sick, tend my wounds after beatings, read to me from her master's books when no one was watching. Abigail felt a stab of something that might have been jealousy, but she pushed it aside. She taught you to read. She did. Sarah was a house slave, educated so she could help with correspondence and accounts. She risked severe punishment every time she shared that knowledge with me. Thomas picked up a stick and poked at the fire, sending sparks dancing into the night sky. When the war ended and we were freed, I asked her to marry me. She said yes. His voice grew softer. We planned to go north, start a farm, maybe have children. But Sarah had been weakened by years of poor treatment. She caught pneumonia that first winter of freedom, and he didn't finish the sentence. But he didn't need to. I held her hand as she died, Thomas continued, and I promised her that if I ever found someone who needed saving the way she had saved me, I would do whatever it took to help them find freedom. Abigail was quiet for a moment, processing this revelation. So when you saw me on that auction block, I saw someone who needed the same gift Sarah had given me, not just freedom from bondage, but the knowledge that they were worth saving. Thomas looked at her directly. But somewhere along the way, Abigail, it stopped being about keeping a promise to Sarah. It became about you, about who you are, not who you reminded me of. And who am I? She asked, echoing his question from the night of the rescue. You're the woman who burned down Henderson's barn to save me, Thomas said with a smile. You're the woman who learned to read poetry and shoot straight and plan a daring escape. You're not Sarah's ghost, Abigail. You're your own person, and you're magnificent. That night, as they lay in their separate bedrolls on opposite sides of their small cabin, Abigail stared at the ceiling and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't gratitude anymore, or even friendship. It was something deeper, more complicated, and entirely her own. For the first time in her life, she was falling in love not out of dependence or desperation, but out of choice. The morning Abigail woke to find Thomas burning with fever changed everything between them. He had pushed himself to hard repairing the cabin roof in the cold mountain air, and now he lay delirious, his body racked with chills despite the blankets she piled on. Himmy for 3 days, Abigail barely left his side. She bathed his forehead with cold water, forced herbal tea between his lips, and held his hand through the worst of the fever dreams. When he called out Sarah's name in his delirium, Abigail felt no jealousy, only determination to fight for the man who had taught her what love could look like. On the 4th morning, Thomas's fever broke. His eyes opened clear and focused, finding her immediately. You stayed, he said, his voice hoarse but wondering. Where else would I go? Abigail smoothed the hair back from his forehead, a gesture so natural she didn't think about it until she saw the way he looked at her hand. Abigail, he said softly, catching her fingers in his. I need you to know what I feel for you. It's not because of Sarah anymore. It's not about any promise or debt. I know. She intertwined their fingers, marveling at how right it felt. I feel it too. They were quiet for a moment, both understanding that something fundamental had shifted between them. Then Thomas, still weak but determined, struggled to sit up. There's something else. While I was fevering, I heard things, voices carrying on the wind from the valley below. Abigail frowned. What kind of voices? People calling for help. Children crying. I think there's sickness in San Benito, something worse than what I had. Over the next few days, as Thomas regained his strength. They made careful trips to the edge of their valley. Using field glasses Thomas had found in the mining camp, they could see unusual activity in the town below. Smoke from too many fires, horses arriving at strange hours, the organized movement of people that suggested emergency. It could be cholera, Thomas said grimly, or typhoid. Either way, people are dying. Good, Abigail said harshly. Let them reap what they've sown. Thomas turned to look at her, and she saw disappointment in his eyes. Is that really what you believe? The question stung because she knew the answer. In her heart, she didn't wish suffering on anyone, not even those who had hurt them. Thomas had taught her too much about dignity and compassion for such feelings. To sit comfortably in her soul, no, she admitted. But they tried to destroy us. Why should we help them? Because helping people isn't about whether they deserve it, Thomas said gently. It's about who we choose to be. That night, Abigail lay awake thinking about the herbs Thomas had taught her to identify, the healing teas Sarah had shown him to make. She thought about the medical knowledge they had accumulated through necessity and study, and about the town below where children might be dying, while their parents' prejudice prevented them from seeking help from the wrong sources. By morning, her decision was made. If we go back, she said as they shared breakfast, they'll arrest you again. Maybe both of us this time. Probably, Thomas agreed. And if we help them, they still won't accept us. They still won't see us as equals. Probably not. Abigail studied his face, seeing the resolution there that matched her own. But we're going anyway. Yes, Thomas said simply. Because that's who we've chosen to be. As they began packing their medical supplies and preparing for the dangerous journey back to San Benito, Abigail realized this was what true freedom meant, not the absence of danger or hardship, but the power to choose your own path, even when it led toward those who had wronged you. They entered San Benito at dawn, when the streets were empty except for the dying. Bodies lay covered in sheets outside homes where families could no longer care for them. The smell of sickness and death hung heavy in the morning air, and even the birds seemed to have fled the town. Abigail pulled her shawl closer as they walked their horses down Main Street. The prosperous shops she remembered stood shuttered, with quarantine notices nailed to their doors. At the church, a long line of freshly dug graves marred the once pristine cemetery. Dear God, she whispered. Thomas dismounted outside Dr. Hamilton's office, where a sign read "Physician deceased, seek help elsewhere." Through the window, they could see Mrs. Hamilton sitting alone, staring at nothing. Double quotes Mrs. Hamilton. Thomas called gently through the door. It's Thomas Washington. We've come to help. The woman looked up with hollow eyes. Thomas, but you. The sheriff said you were a criminal. The sheriff was wrong about many things, Abigail said, stepping forward. We have medicine. Herbs that can help with the fever. Double quotes Mrs. Hamilton's face crumpled. My husband, he died 3 days ago. So many are gone. The Morrison boy, little Sarah Chin. Even Reverend Hayes. Thomas and Abigail exchanged glances. Reverend Hayes, who had preached so vehemently against them, was among the victims. Show us who needs help, Thomas said simply. What followed were the longest days of Abigail's life. They moved from house to house, tending the sick with willow bark tea for fever, clean water for dehydration, and honey-based tonics for strength. Thomas's knowledge of herbs, combined with what they had learned during their mountain exile, proved invaluable. At the Henderson house, Mrs. Henderson, who had treated them with such disdain, wept as Abigail spooned medicine into her fevered grandson's mouth. Why? The woman asked through her tears. After how we treated you, why would you help us? Abigail paused in her ministrations. Because he's a child, and children shouldn't suffer for their elders' mistakes. Word spread quickly through the town. The escaped criminal and his shameful companion had returned not as conquerors, but as healers. Families who had once crossed the street to avoid them now opened their doors gratefully. Sheriff Morrison, weak with illness himself, watched from his bed as Thomas treated his wife and remaining children. "I was wrong," he admitted hoarsely. "About the locket, about everything. Mrs. Henderson found it in her own wash basket after we arrested you." "I know," Thomas replied, not pausing in his work. "But anger won't heal your family." The turning point came when Mayor Coleman, delirious with fever, grabbed Abigail's hand as she tended him. "I'm sorry," he gasped. "So sorry for what we did. You're an angel." "No," Abigail said gently, adjusting his blankets. "I'm just a woman who learned that hatred is a sickness worse than any fever." By the end of the second week, the epidemic was breaking. More people were recovering than dying, and the streets began to show signs of life again. But the town that emerged from the crisis was different, humbled, changed by the experience of being saved by those they had tried to destroy. Thomas and Abigail worked until they were exhausted, until their supplies ran low, until the last patient could sit up and take water without help. Only then did they allow themselves to rest. Sitting on the church steps as the sun set, Abigail looked at Thomas's clothes stained with the work of healing, his face lined with fatigue but peaceful. "What happens now?" she asked. Thomas smiled, taking her hand. "Now we build something new." 1 year later, Abigail stood in the same town square where she had once been sold like livestock. But now, instead of an auction block, a small schoolhouse occupied the space. Through its windows, she could see children of all backgrounds bent over their lessons, learning to read and write together. The sign above the door read, "Washington Community School, founded by Thomas and Abigail Washington." Yes, Washington. They had married 6 months after the epidemic ended, in a simple ceremony performed by the new minister, a young man who preached love rather than division. The entire town had attended, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for the couple who had taught them about grace. Thomas emerged from the schoolhouse, his face bright with the satisfaction of a good day's teaching. At 45, he moved with the confident stride of a man who had found his purpose. Seeing Abigail, he smiled and reached for her hand. "How were the children today?" she asked, intertwining their fingers. "Wonderful." Little Billy Morrison read an entire paragraph without stumbling, and Martha Chin solved her arithmetic problems faster than I could check them. They walked together toward their new home, not the cabin in the mountains, but a modest house on the edge of town that the grateful community had helped them build. It had a large garden where Abigail grew both vegetables and medicinal herbs, and a workshop where Thomas crafted furniture for their neighbors. "Mrs. Patterson stopped by the clinic today," Abigail said, referring to the small medical practice she had established in the back room of their house. "Her baby is teething, and she wanted some of my chamomile tonic." "The same Mrs. Patterson who once refused to buy your mending." "The very same," Abigail smiled. "People change, Thomas. We've all learned that." As they reached their gate, they found a small group waiting for them. Mayor Coleman, Sheriff Morrison, and Mrs. Henderson, along with several other townspeople. "We don't want to disturb your evening," Coleman said, hat in hand, "but we have something to discuss with you both." Thomas and Abigail exchanged glances. Even now, unexpected visits could still make them wary. "The county is establishing a new regional school," Coleman continued. "They want someone to run it, someone with experience teaching all kinds of children, someone the community trusts. The position comes with a substantial salary and a large house." "They're offering it to us?" Thomas asked, surprised. "The unanimous recommendation of the San Benito Town Council," Sheriff Morrison added. "After everything you've done for us, it's the least we can offer." Abigail felt Thomas's hand tighten around hers. This was more than they had ever dared dream, not just acceptance, but genuine honor and respect. "We'll need time to consider," Thomas said diplomatically. "Of course," Coleman nodded. "But I hope you'll say yes. This town, this whole county, it needs people like you." After the delegation left, Thomas and Abigail sat on their porch swing, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and paint. Can you believe it? Abigail marveled, from an auction block to running a school. Sometimes I think I'm still dreaming. Thomas pulled her closer. If it's a dream, then we're dreaming it together. She thought about the frightened girl who had stood on that platform, certain her life was over. That girl could never have imagined this moment married to a man who cherished her, respected by a community that had once scorned her, using her gifts to heal and teach others. Thomas, she said softly, do you think Sarah would approve of what we built together? Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering. I think Sarah would say we honored her memory by choosing love over hatred, hope over despair. And I think she'd be proud of the woman you've become. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Abigail reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From slavery to freedom, from hatred to love, from despair to hope. They had proven that the human spirit could not only survive the worst cruelty, but transform it into something beautiful. What shall we tell the county about there? Offered, Thomas asked. Abigail smiled, knowing the answer as surely as she knew her own name. We'll tell them yes, we have work to do. In the distance, the church bell chimed the hour, and somewhere in the town that had once tried to destroy them, children slept safely in their beds, dreaming of the lessons they would learn tomorrow from teachers who had shown them that love was stronger than hate, that dignity was more powerful than prejudice, and that every person, no matter where they came from, deserved to be free. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.